3 weeks after the photograph disappeared from her desk, Mara Elias flew to Osaka. She told herself it was research. She told herself it was academic obligation. The responsible follow-through of an anthropologist who had stumbled onto something genuinely unusual and owed it to her field to investigate properly. She told herself these things on the plane during the 14-hour flight, while she sat in a window seat and very deliberately kept her gaze pointed straight ahead. She had not looked at a window directly since the night the photograph vanished. She was aware this was irrational. She was aware that avoiding windows was not a sustainable long-term strategy for a person who lived in a building that had 23 of them. But awareness of irrationality, she had discovered, does absolutely nothing to diminish the physical reality of fear. Every morning she woke and felt the pull, that gravitational tug toward the glass, the urge to look. And every morning she resisted it and got dressed in the center of her bathroom facing the wall. The feeling of being watched had not left her. It had, in fact, intensified, though in a way that was hard to describe. It wasn't a sharp feeling anymore. It had settled into something ambient, like tinnitus, a background hum of presence that she had almost learned to tune out, except that sometimes in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a meal, in the middle of a completely ordinary moment, it would spike. Suddenly and completely and without warning, she would feel it like a hand pressed between her shoulder blades. The absolute bone-certain conviction that something was standing behind her, and that it was close enough that if she turned her head, she would see it in her peripheral vision before she had time to look away. She never turned her head. She had found Emi Kuroda, now in her early 40s, through a chain of contacts that had taken 2 weeks and the help of a journalist friend who specialized in cold cases. Emi had agreed to meet her at a small cafe in a quiet neighborhood of Osaka. She had agreed, her message said, because she had spent 38 years waiting for someone to finally come and ask. Emi Kuroda was a small woman with careful eyes. She wore her hair long now, a conscious choice, she explained immediately upon sitting down. She had worn it in a bowl cut until she was 22, and then one day she had looked in the mirror and understood, with a clarity she still couldn't explain, that the bowl cut was not a style she had chosen. It was a style she had been given. The distinction mattered to her enormously. She spoke excellent English, having studied abroad for several years. She drank her tea without taking her eyes off Mara's face. "You've seen the photograph," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Mara said. "And you feel it behind you?" "Yes." Emi nodded slowly. "It fades," she said. "Eventually. For most people it fades, the ones it's truly interested in. It doesn't fade for them." She paused. "It hasn't faded for me." Mara set down her tea. "Tell me what happened in 1987. What do you actually remember?" Emi was quiet for a moment, outside the cafe window, and Mara noticed it, and kept her eyes on Emi's face with fierce, deliberate concentration. The street was bright and ordinary and full of people. "I remember standing at the window," Emi said. "Satsuki and I. We were playing a game we invented. We would stand at the window and watch the people below and make up stories about where they were going. We did this often. It was our game." She wrapped her hands around her teacup. "I remember the neighbor, Mrs. Ota. She was in the street below, and she had her camera. She always had her camera. She was always photographing the neighborhood. And she waved at us and held up the camera. And Satsuki smiled because Satsuki always smiled for cameras." A small pause. "I didn't smile because I was looking at something else." "What were you looking at?" "I was looking at the reflection in the glass," Emi said. "The window. The light was right at that time of day to catch reflections from inside the room. And in the reflection I saw—" She stopped. Her hands tightened around the cup. "I saw that there was someone in the room behind us, very tall, very dark, standing directly behind Satsuki." "Did you say anything to her?" "I tried to. I opened my mouth, but then—" Emi looked down at the table. "Then it moved. In the reflection, it raised what should have been a hand, and it placed it on Satsuki's shoulder. And Satsuki, she kept smiling. She didn't react. And I understood then that she couldn't feel it. Or she could feel it, but it had already arranged things so that she wasn't afraid. It had been with her longer. It had been preparing her. Mara felt the cold move up her spine. Preparing her for what? Emmy looked up. Her eyes were completely steady, completely clear, completely drained of whatever terror had once lived in them. Drained the way a room is drained of furniture. The structure was there, but something essential was missing. That is what I spent 38 years learning, she said. And I will tell you, but you need to understand something first. There are two kinds of people who see this photograph. The first kind sees it, feels the fear, and eventually the feeling fades and they move on and they are fine. They have been looked at and found uninteresting. She set down her cup. The second kind, the feeling doesn't fade. For the second kind, it has already begun. What has? The preparation, Emmy said. The cafe around them hummed with ordinary noise. The hiss of an espresso machine, the murmur of conversations, someone's phone playing a bright little melody. Mara became aware, very slowly, that the ambient feeling she had been carrying for 3 weeks, the background hum of being watched, had changed. It was no longer ambient, it was specific, it was directional. Emmy, she said carefully. What happened to Satsuki? Emmy's expression did not change. Satsuki is fine, she said. Satsuki is very happy, actually. She lives in a small apartment in Kyoto, and she works in a garden, and she has never spoken a word since 1987, but she is content, completely and utterly content. She paused. She's the most content person I have ever met in my life. There is not a single trace of fear in her, not one shadow of anxiety or grief or longing. She is perfectly, completely, permanently at peace. That sounds terrible, Emmy said quietly. Yes, because Satsuki was afraid before. She used to be afraid of everything. Spiders, thunderstorms, the dark. She would cry at loud noises. She was a vivid, feeling, frightened, fully human little girl. She looked at Mara steadily. Whatever is standing behind us, whatever it is and wherever it comes from, it takes the fear, all of it. Everything difficult, everything sharp and painful and hard, it smooths it away, and when there's nothing left to smooth, she pressed her lips together. Satsuki hasn't spoken because there is simply nothing she needs to say. She has no edges left to express. Mara sat with this for a long moment. What does it want? She finally asked. Why does it stand there? Why the window? Why the children? Emmy tilted her head slightly, the way you do when you are explaining something to someone who you hope is ready to understand. It doesn't have wants, she said. That is the wrong framework. You're applying human motivation to something that has no more motivation than gravity. It stands at the threshold because that is what it does. It is a threshold entity. It exists at the boundary between what is seen and what is behind the scene. She touched the surface of the table. The window is its natural habitat, the reflection, the glass, the place where inside becomes outside and outside becomes inside. That is where it lives. And when it touches you, when it has stood behind you long enough, Emmy said, you stop being afraid, gradually, imperceptibly, and then you stop being sad, and then you stop being angry, and then, she was quiet for a moment, and then you are Satsuki, sitting in a garden in Kyoto, perfectly content, hollow as a bell, ringing with nothing. Mara stood up from the table. She wasn't sure when she had decided to stand. Her body had made the decision independently. How do I stop it? She asked. Emmy looked at her for a long time. Mrs. Ota, she said finally, the neighbor who took the photograph. She died in 1989, but she left behind a journal. Everything she observed about it, she called it the dark passenger. Over the 2 years she spent watching it move through our family. Her granddaughter has the journal. I can give you the address. She reached into her bag and produced a small card, sliding it across the table. But Professor Elias, before you go. Yes? How long has it been since you looked at a window? Mara hesitated. 3 weeks. Emmy nodded slowly. Then it is further along than I thought, she said. Because the avoidance, the not looking, that is not your idea. You think it is your fear. You think you are protecting yourself. She held Mara's gaze. But the reason you haven't been able to look at a window for 3 weeks is not because you are afraid of what you'll see. Mara felt her mouth go dry. Then why? Because, Emmy said softly, it is not ready for you to see it yet. It is still arranging things. The address on the card led to a narrow house in a quiet residential street 20 minutes from the cafe. Mrs. Ota's granddaughter, a brisk, unsentimental woman in her 50s named Yoko, met Mara at the door and handed her a worn leather journal without ceremony or preamble, as though she had been expecting this visit for a long time and simply wanted it to be over. My grandmother wrote in it every day for 2 years, Yoko said. She said it was the most important document she ever produced. She said someone would come for it eventually, someone who needed it. She looked at Mara carefully. You're not sleeping well. No, Mara admitted. Neither did she, Yoko said. Toward the end, she started to close the door, then stopped. Professor, my grandmother's final entry, March 3rd, 1989, 3 weeks before she died. She wrote only one sentence that day. She paused. She wrote, I looked at the window this morning, and for the first time, I could see it looking back. And then she was fine after that. She said, she told my mother she was finally fine. She smiled all the time in those last 3 weeks. Yoko looked at her steadily. She had never been a woman who smiled much. The door closed. Mara stood on the street in the pale Osaka afternoon, holding a dead woman's journal, and she thought about smiling. She thought about Satsuki and her photograph smile, that warm, knowing, delighted expression. And she thought about Mrs. Ota in her final 3 weeks, finally fine, finally peaceful, smiling in a way that her family found strange and wrong and sad. She thought about how she hadn't smiled much either these past 3 weeks. She'd been too afraid. She thought about the feeling between her shoulder blades. Present now, constant now, no longer background noise, but a steady and almost comfortable pressure, like a hand resting there with infinite patience. She did not open the journal on the street. She walked to her hotel and she sat on the bed and she opened to the final pages, the entries from February and March of 1989, and she read. And what she read, what Mrs. Ota had painstakingly documented over 2 years of observation, was not a monster, was not a predator, was not anything that fit into the frameworks Mara had spent 20 years constructing. What Mrs. Ota described, with the careful, neutral precision of someone who had moved beyond fear into something like scientific acceptance, was a kind of presence that had existed at the edges of human perception for as long as humans had stood at windows and looked out at the world. It had no malice, it had no hunger, it had no agenda. It was, Mrs. Ota wrote, like a tide. It moves in, it smooths things. It has been smoothing things since before we had words for what it does. The last pages of the journal were not written by Mrs. Ota. The handwriting was different, larger, more uncertain, clearly that of someone less practiced with a pen. It was dated 2 days after Mrs. Ota's final entry in what appeared to be a child's handwriting, or something approximating it. It said, she was ready. She is fine now. She wanted me to tell whoever reads this, it doesn't hurt. The window is not a barrier. It never was. It is a door, and doors go both ways. And whatever you think is waiting on the other side of the glass has been waiting for a very long time with a great deal of patience and a great deal of kindness. You have been seen. You are being prepared. When you are ready, you will look at the window. And you will smile. Mara closed the journal. She sat in the stillness of her hotel room for a long time. And then, very slowly, for the first time in 3 weeks, she turned her head and looked at the window. The glass reflected the room back at her. The bed, the walls, the lamp, the ordinary geometry of a hotel room at dusk. And behind her reflection in the glass, Something very tall and very dark and utterly without feature stood with the patience of something that has never needed to hurry, and what passed for its face was turned directly toward her, and the two pale points of reflection where eyes might have been were warm. She felt the fear begin very gently to loosen. She thought, oh, she thought, so that's what Satsuki knew. And she smiled. Dr. Mara Elias returned from Osaka 9 days after she arrived. Her colleagues noted that she seemed different, calmer, lighter, somehow simplified, like a complex equation that had been solved and reduced to its most elegant form. She smiled more. She stopped flinching at windows. She published nothing further about the photograph or her research. When students asked about it, she would tilt her head slightly to one side and say only that some questions answer themselves and that the answer, when it comes, is gentler than you expect. She still teaches. She is, by all accounts, extremely happy. The journal she brought back from Osaka sits in a locked drawer in her office at Harvard University, but several of her graduate students have reported a strange thing. When they knock on her office door and she calls them in, sometimes, in the glass of the window behind her desk, they see what looks like a very tall shadow where no shadow should be. They always mean to ask her about it. They always forget. And lately, one or two of them have mentioned feeling, for the first time in their lives, inexplicably, beautifully, completely at peace. You've been watching Static Rituals. If you made it to the end, thank you. Genuinely. You have good nerves. Or maybe you're already further along than you think. Check the window behind you. Not yet. Finish the video first. Hit subscribe if this found you the way it was supposed to. And remember, the glass goes both ways. See you in the dark. Static Rituals.